I would like to officially welcome everybody to our Diversity Council Annual General Assembly meeting. Very long name on LGBTQ plus voices and inclusion. This is a very important and special program. Every year, for those of you who are new, we always host a program around this time of year that deals with LGBTQ plus inclusion, challenges in the classroom, and we invite leading figures from our communities to serve as our keynotes, because the best way to learn is from those who have lived experiences. The program today will run in 2 parts. So especially for some Kean undergrads, part 2 may be less relevant, but the first part we will have our keynote speaker, Rabbi Stein, and the second part will be led by David Schwartz, who will be speaking about the integration of LGBTQ histories and the mandate in New Jersey. So I am going to hand things over to our Diversity Council President, Nikki Savino, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Adara. It is a real great pleasure for me to be able to be here today and serving as the president of the Diversity Council. We do a lot of great programming for educators and for people who are concerned with the general status of humanity in general. And this event is no exception to that. And just a little bit about the Diversity Council. Our goal, our mission is to be able to bring light to issues of humanity, as far as for educators, to help give them resources to bring to their classroom, to help be able to have the tools to teach about prejudice reduction, to teach about the issues of LGBTQ in a meaningful way, to be able to empower our students and to help bring up ways for them to become the next leaders of tomorrow that we so desperately need in the world today. And sometimes that becomes very challenging. We don't always know the right way to tackle issues in our classes, and it does become very daunting. And so our goal here is to be able to provide the resources, the information, and the inspiration to be able to tackle those subjects and to do that successfully. So it is my pleasure today to offer you an introduction to our keynote speaker, Rabbi Stein. Rabbi Stein is a Jewish educator, author, speaker, and activist. She was born and raised in a Hasidic family of rabbinic descent and is a direct descendant of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism. Abby attended yeshiva, completing a rabbinical degree in 2011. In 2012, she left the Hasidic world to explore a self-determined life. In 2015, Abby came out as a woman of trans experience. Since coming out, she has been working to raise support and awareness for trans rights and those leaving ultra-Orthodoxy. Her story has been covered in the New York Times, New York Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Magazine, Jewish Daily Forward, Daily Mail, NBC, Vogue, InStyle, and more, as well as live appearances on CNN, Fox News, HuffPost Live, Showtime, Now This, Pop Sugar, and as well as internationally. In 2016, Abby was named by the Jewish Week as one of the 36 under 36 young Jews who are inspiring change in the world. In 2018, she was awarded the Pride Award by the Brooklyn Borough President. She studied gender studies and political science at Columbia University in New York City. Abby's book, Becoming Eve, My Journey from the Ultra-Orthodox Rabbi to Transgender Woman, a coming-of-age memoir, was published by Seal Press in November of 2019. The Diversity Council is truly honored to have Abby here with us this afternoon to share her story. And again, as Adara mentioned, after her presentation, we'll have time for questions and answers, which I'm sure everyone is going to have. And then David is going to help us unpack this for those of you who are educators and are eager to know, how can I use this in my classroom? So without further ado, I am really, really excited to turn this presentation over to Rabbi Stein.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you, Adara, for, well, you're the one who I've been in touch with and that I spoke with. I was listening to you, Nikin, and I know you did a really great job, like just like going through the bio and everything. But in my mind, I just can't. I didn't write it, and I just can't take the list of all the media, which is cool, great, amazing. Someone wrote it and thought it was cool. I don't want to focus on that too much. But thank you for the warm welcome. I have two, let's call them housekeeping notes before I get started. First, I see that only, Adara, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you say this was going to be a webinar? No. Was that a different event I was talking about?
Not a
Okay,
webinar.
sorry. I'm doing far too many, but I love it, and I love that I can see all your faces, but I see like only about like 50 of you or so have your videos on. So for those of you who feel comfortable, I want to encourage you to turn on your video. I know we all have Zoom fatigue, pandemic fatigue, give it whichever name you want, but as a result, also no one cares what you're wearing. I mean, if you're wearing something cool, I mean, good for you, we might focus on that, but otherwise, what you're wearing or the lack thereof, well, as long as you're decent, shouldn't keep you from turning on your video. I love to see people's faces, so if you can, do put it on. One other thing, so as Nikki mentioned, we're gonna do Q&A towards the end. However, if I say something that you don't understand, I use very common an example I use is Shabbat. It's the Jewish Sabbath, for those of you who might not know, which starts on Friday night, ends on Saturday night. But just to give a random example, I say Shabbat and you were like, sorry, what is that? I want you to stop me. So I'm not going to be paying that much attention to the chat box as I'm talking, besides during the times when I'm asking people to engage a bit. So I will encourage, I guess, Nikki and Adara are the people in control here. So if you see that someone is asking, what is that term that she just said? I think that applies both to anything religious or specifically Jewish. Like, I feel like as much as educators and as rabbis, we try our best to educate people and to explain what we're saying. We sometimes get into certain modes where we're used to certain terms. And the same, and I would say even more importantly, for this talk, LGBTQ terms. We sometimes have our own language, I feel like. So I say a term and you're like, oh, what does cisgender mean? What does transgender mean? Well, we're obviously going to talk a bit about that. But specifically, if I say something you don't understand, do stop me. Well, put in the chat and I will encourage Nikki or Dara or anyone else who can unmute themselves to stop me and make me explain it. Okay, now I'm going to do something I literally decided the last minute to do that. I usually start with a reading from my book. I don't know how many of you have read it. I assume most of you have not. Towards the end, I will share a link and you can all get it. I personally encourage people to buy it from local bookstores. There's even the link that I will share can even take you to IndieBound, which is a website that can show you which local bookstores have it. So that is what I usually think is important. But or you can be evil and get it from Amazon. It's totally up to you. I usually start with a reading from the book. And I was going to do a part where I come out to my dad. He makes a very sexist comment. Before he even got to be transphobic, he said something extremely sexist. But then I realized we're a group of educators, I think, a lot of us. I assume not everyone. I think there's also students, but it's fine. Students can also be educators. We should all be educators in some ways. And I want to read a part that I've never done. I never even thought about it, really. I want to read a few paragraphs from the acknowledgements. So for those of you who have read my book, or hopefully will read it or listen to it, my book is mostly a coming of age story. A lot of people buy it or start reading it thinking there's going to be a lot about me leaving the fundamentalist religious community I grew up in or about transition. And yes, there is a lot of that, but chronologically, it mostly focused from, well, let's just say before my birth. Literally, the first story in the book is about my, 10 times great-grandfather who lived in the 18th century, who founded our movement. So it's literally about my family, my background, and my life up to 2012 when I'm leaving. So the acknowledgements ended up being a part where I got to talk a bit about my experience in college. I felt as educators, it might give you all a sense because there's so many, I wouldn't have been able to successfully transition without the help of so many, but specifically I was privileged to transition while I was an undergrad, while I was a student at Columbia, and got so much support from so many people. And I think the first lesson or the first thing that I can teach everyone and that I can show all of you from my personal experience is how impactful and how powerful these very small and very basic things that you might think you're just doing the bare minimum sometimes, which you shouldn't do. We should do a lot more than that. But hypothetically, the bare minimum to help or support the student, whatever they are, 5 years old or 50 years old, in their journey. So I want to read a few paragraphs here, which is mostly saying there's like one page of that thanking the people that I got to interact with at Columbia. I'm sorry if it's weird. I've never read it out loud, so bear with me. I've done hundreds of book events, but never thought of reading from this, but I'm going to go with it. Thank you to those at Columbia University. I'm grateful to the late School of General Studies Dean, Peter Ahn, may his memory be a blessing, who pushed me to apply and showed a keen interest not only in my academics, but also my personal life. With his constant smile and witty remarks, he knew what to say at every moment, drawing on his own experience with religious fundamentalism and LGBTQ life. To my advisors and the Sarah, RJ, I'm going to skip the names because I assume most of you don't know these people anyway, and the rest of the deans of students who supported me from the beginning as I was navigating a modern classroom for the first time in my life. Community Impact at Columbia University, the volunteer-run group where I took the first college classes in my life and who offered me a free taste of Columbia before I applied. To so many professors who went above and beyond, taking into account my personal struggles as they influenced my learning. The list is long, but they know who they are. To GS Alliance, the LGBTQ student group at the School of General Studies at Columbia, the Columbia Queer Alliance, the university-wide LGBTQ student group, Gender Revolution, Columbia's trans student support group, and the Columbia Atheist Agnostic Student Society. The General Studies student body, as well as many other student groups who made me feel at home at Columbia before, during, and after my transition. I'm going to stop here. Just a taste. I'm going to try not to give many book spoilers, so I hope that many of you will get enticed enough to read it after that. But let me jump in a bit. So I want to start by talking about the background, the community I come from. I don't know how many of you know anything about me. I get a feeling that most of you probably don't know much, or at least I always walk into a room physically or virtually, assuming that no one knows anything. It's impossible for me to talk about my experience without talking a bit, and maybe a bit more than a bit, about the community I was raised in. Very simply, I grew up in the ultra-Orthodox Jewish Hasidic community. These are a lot of words, I'm very much aware, and quite a mouthful. Most of us just identified as Hasidic. Now, what is Hasidic Judaism? Damn, I don't even know where to start, specifically given that I know many of you probably don't know that much about Judaism, which is totally fine. As I'm going to try to take the next probably 10 to 15 minutes to explain a bit about the Hasidic community, especially in the context of gender and sexuality, I would love to hear from some of you. So if you know anything about the Hasidic community, it could be, given that I assume many of you are in the New York metropolitan area, it's kind of hard to avoid them altogether in this area. So, or it's something that you watched online. There have been many projects over the past few years in the media about the Hasidic community, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them neutral, all kinds of things. Whatever it is you know or you think you know, if you can put in the chat some ideas, I would love to see it. I would love to hear some ideas. Oh my God, Steve says Rockland County and Williamsburg. These are literally the two places that I lived. I feel very put on the spot. Let me talk a bit about the Hasidic community, specifically today's community. Now, part of my bio, which as much as I used to think it's not so much who I am, everyone from the media to my agent to every community I've ever worked with is trying to convince me that it's actually a really big deal that I happen to be a direct descendant, 5 times actually, from the founder of the Hasidic movement. Now, for those of you who know nothing about the Hasidic community, that person, the guy, my great-great-grandfather, he passed away in 1760. His name was Israel ben Eliezer. He's known as the Baal Shem Tov, which means master of the good name. He founded a movement and later on became, to this day, the go-to title that Hasidic people use when they talk about him. It's a Hebrew term that translates to the light of the 7 days. It is a Kabbalistic, Jewish mystic teaching that the first 7 days of creation, until like the original sin in the Bible, until like Adam and Eve ate from the tree they were not supposed to eat from, there was a light that shined, that became so strong that God said humanity can't survive without light, and end up hiding it. In the Hasidic community, that's how they see him. Their founder is like, they don't call him a prophet because in Judaism prophecy ended with the Bible, but he is as holy as it gets in their minds. I used to think it's not a big deal. Yes, I happen to be a descendant of him. My father wouldn't stop talking about it when we were children. But I actually learned that it means a lot for the opposite reason that I taught growing up. Studying his teachings helped me realize that the Hasidic community that I was raised in has very little to do with his Hasidic movement. Hasidic Judaism was originally founded as a populist, well, not in the political sense today, but a movement that was focused on individual spirituality, individual paths to the divine, as opposed to focusing on following rules. They were focused on joy and spirituality above laws, and so on. Today, the Hasidic community is the polar opposite of that. Imagine, I don't know, if you don't know anything about the Hasidic community, imagine a very fundamentalist community that you do know, and then add a few layers. People jump when I call them a cult. So I like to prefer culture. So I think the only reason they're not a cult is because they're a bit too big. If you look up the dictionary definition of a cult, many Hasidic communities, including the way I was raised, very much fit every dictionary definition. They're not suicidal, they're not Joe and the Sun, if that's the cult you're thinking about. I'm gonna share my screen, assuming I can do that, yes, okay. I want to focus specifically on the community, a few details. The Hasidic culture today, the way they live, is a relatively new experience. Some of the basics, actually, I have an idea. I wasn't going to do that, but I think this might be helpful. I want to show a video. I was going to show other videos, but I want to show a video where I talk a bit about it, and I think it will be a lot easier than me spending the next 10 minutes trying to explain the basics. And then I will take that to focus mostly on gender and sexuality. I always like to joke that I'm so far the only female ordained ultra-Orthodox rabbi. Hopefully there will be more eventually. And I also always say that I don't have a lot of interest in performing weddings, but I want to be the first ultra-Orthodox ordained rabbi to perform a gay wedding. Every time people ask me to define myself or give like a one-sentence bio, I struggle with it. It's a hard thing to do. My go-to usually is, I'm Rabbi Stein. I grew up in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, New York. I'm 26 years old. I'm a student, activist, educator, public speaker, and a woman of trans experience. I grew up with a very religious life with no access to anything that we would call pop culture. So no movies, TV shows, radio, music, magazines, and so on. Growing up, I never identified as a boy. I don't remember a single day in my life where I identified as a boy. I obviously presented as so. I was told that that's who I am, but to me it was just, I just knew it. It just wasn't right. However, because of the way the Hasidic community is, that wasn't something that I could explore in any way. The Hasidic community is not just against transgender people and trans rights. At least when I was growing up, trans people simply didn't exist. I got engaged when I was 17, got married when I was 18. When I was 19, I had a son. I learned the first time that trans people exist, the first time I was online, which is when I was 20. So the first thing that I ever Googled was whatever a boy can turn into a girl. And then I learned there are millions of people out there like me. I started physical transition in September of 2015. I came out to my parents and to all of my friends in November of 2015 and haven't looked back since. Until I came out, there was no one in the Hasidic community, which is a community worldwide of maybe close to 1 million people,
no one who has come out as trans, when statistically there's a few thousand of us. And I started seeing it personally. In November of 2015, I started a support group, just 45 people by now. All people grew up ultra-Orthodox and are transgender in one way or another. In December of 2015, we had our first in-person support group, and 12 people showed up, all living just in the New York area. People come from Orthodox backgrounds who are dealing with their own gender identity in a community where that doesn't exist. That is the biggest part that made me realize I have an opportunity now. The media started reaching out because they like the story and it's very exotic, but at the same time, they gave me an opportunity to raise awareness. I've in the last 2.5 years given over 120 speeches all over the world in so many different states, a lot of them at colleges, a lot of them at community centers, but a lot of them just all over. I wasn't looking at any way to become an activist, which is by now a title that I love. I'm not really in touch with a lot of people, and I kind of don't really care. The only people that I miss are my family. I will be the first person to admit that to some extent it takes a lot of courage. For every trans person, well, for every queer person, gay person, lesbian person, bisexual person to come out takes courage to some extent. But by the time I transitioned, it was like because I felt there is no other choice. If I want to live, I have to do that. If I would have been really courageous, I would have transitioned when I was 18 or when I was 12. What gives me today the most courage is working, like talking with people, talking one-on-one with people and being like, oh my God, my story that just feels like my own story and doesn't feel like a big deal actually helps these people. And that is what keeps me going.
I hope this gives a bit of a sense. Two more points that I want to make before I get to the slides. One of the strong, I think, ways to look at it is the US, and I hinted at in the video as well, the US unfortunately doesn't lack fundamentalist communities. We probably don't lack communities that tell their kids not to watch popular TV shows or listen to certain music. I think where the Hasidic community and maybe some other communities becomes a bit unique is that it wasn't forbidden for me. I was a child in the 90s, okay? I don't know what were the most popular TV shows at the time. I use sometimes as examples, I use Friends or even Seinfeld, which is probably one of the most Jewish TV shows to have ever been on air. They were not forbidden. It wasn't like, oh, I knew there are these things out there that I'm not allowed to watch. I was unaware that they even existed. And the same would be true for the vast majority of Hasidic kids and teenagers in places like Williamsburg and in many other communities. The music that I was not allowed to listen to wasn't some pop band or some rock band that I was unaware, I don't know, Backstreet Boys or whatever was popular in the 90s. I was unaware that they existed. Forbidden Music for me was an Orthodox Jewish band of boys that sang in English, and that was the big problem. That is the culture that we're talking about. And it's going to come in a lot more when it comes to gender and sexuality. The origins of the Hasidic community today is relatively new. And many people, both in the Jewish community, in the Hasidic community, in the Jewish world as a whole, and beyond, like to look on communities like that, and I think for fundamentalist communities in general, and be like, oh my God, this is like so authentic. And I have heard these comments from secular Jews and surprisingly a lot from Christians who are very grew up with the Bible and like, oh my God, these people live just like the Bible. And I'm like, no, they don't. And so on. What a lot of people miss is it's a relatively new culture. Religious practices a bit less, but the culture specifically didn't look the way it looks today until after the Holocaust. A part of it was a response to the Holocaust. As a community, there's a lot of untreated communal trauma. I'm not going to go into that necessarily, but just as much, it was a reaction to the outside world. And by the outside world, I mean both the non-Jewish world as well as Jews who are not ultra-Orthodox, which is like 90% of American Jews. They saw that as a threat. As a result, they tried to create as much possible a segregated community, both in terms of the outside world And then we get to the gender segregation. I spent a year, when I was an undergrad, I spent a year helping a doctoral student at Columbia who was doing her PhD in gender segregation of fundamentalist communities across the Americas. And we could not find a community anywhere in the world that was more gender segregated. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but as far as I can tell, I'm yet to interact with a community like that. I will show a video in a minute that I think could help get that picture even clearer. But it's not just a patriarchal society. Just like I mentioned before that pop culture wasn't forbidden, we didn't know it exists. Calling the Hasidic community a patriarchal society just doesn't do it justice, really. It is to an extreme where men are not just in control, they are the action. They are the people who do everything. And in many communal settings, women or people seen as women are observers, as opposed to participating in any meaningful way in the community. I want to jump out a bit. I don't want to focus on this too much and get to the gender part, but just a bit about my personal life. I come from a standard New York family of 13. I have 12 siblings, 8 sisters and 4 brothers. And by standard, yes, I know that's not standard for most people in New York, but it is very standard in the Hasidic community. My family wasn't even the biggest that I knew. In my extended family, there's several families with 20 plus kids. And we're not talking here second and third marriages. We're talking one couple, one wife, husband and wife, who have over 20 kids. That is considered for us, that would be like, oh my God, that's a big family. 13, yeah, nicely sized. Let's call that equivalent of 3 or maybe 4 kids in the American culture as a whole. Both of my parents come from dynasties of Hasidic rabbis. So let me confuse you all a bit about what a Hasidic rabbi is. And it's not the same thing as a rabbi. A rabbi, which I assume many of you know, not all rabbis are even Orthodox in any way. A rabbi is very similar, not exactly, but a similar concept to a priest and a monk and an imam and clergy in many different communities. A Rabbi is very different. Some rabbis also happen to be rabbis. The majority of Hasidic rabbis are not rabbis. Some rabbis are not even rabbis. Sorry if that is confusing. A Rabbi, the closest thing that I can think that exists that people tend to know a bit more about is an Ayatollah. A Rabbi is a supreme leader of a Hasidic community that ultimately is in control of spiritual, communal, institutional, financial, and political leadership of a community. They are the ultimate boss in every sense of the word. They don't report to anyone. No one oversees them. And it kind of works very similar to monarchies, where it goes from father to son. Well, a bit more sexist, because if a Rebbe dies and only has daughters, the son-in-law will take him over, never a daughter. I was engaged at 17 and married at 18 and had a son at 19, so I guess I was a teen mom in many ways. Very common. None of my siblings, there's so far 12 of them who have been above the age of 18, none of us reached 19 single. We were all either, most of us married or engaged by the time we were 18. So yeah, when I watch TV shows of teen moms, I'm like, you mean like literally everyone I knew growing up. Talking of weddings. Now I mentioned before, and I'm gonna focus a bit more on the gender and sexuality part. I wanna show a video. This video are 2 clips, both of them Hasidic weddings in the 90s, both of them my cousins, both of them the grandkids of a great uncle of mine who was one of the biggest Hasidic leaders after the war in Brooklyn. I want to watch it and I want us to pay attention to what you pick up about gender roles as well as sexuality in that community, and then we'll kind of bring it home. So as I show this video, pay attention. What are you picking up? What do you see about gender roles? What do you see about sexuality? Try not to get too distracted by a lot of the exotic details. I know it's very easy to get distracted. And then I would love to get some comments. So ideally, if I can have like 2 or 3 people who are courageous enough, come on, we're a lot of educators. We should all have the courage to speak up. So courageous enough to speak up and give me some comments just on that video. So I'm not going to take questions. Questions will be later, but just some questions and comments on that video after I show it. probably wait 10 minutes now and let it sit with you all. But let me get some questions, comments, reflections just on that video. I'm sure there are many of you who have thoughts. I watch your faces. So I would love to hear from some people. If you can put in the chat as well. I would try to read them, but I would love to get, can people unmute themselves at that if they want? So if you want to unmute yourself and maybe raise your hand to the reaction. Katie, go ahead.
So it looked like, first off, that it was basically all males in the room. They all had the same outfits
Hold on, who else would be there?
For instance, maybe women.
What is that?
Women?
What is that?
Oh, why? Just
no, what is that? What are you talking about?
Oh, so I guess
I am messing with you. I heard you the first time. You're just like, women, what? Women in a room dancing. Are you out of your mind? No, but yes, I will explain it in a minute. Thank you. Keep going.
It looked like everybody had the same outfit on, aside from the two gentlemen front and center that had the fancier jackets on.
Yes.
Or that
Okay.
something. And then it looked like the woman was on a leash almost.
Thank you. All of that really great reflections. Yeah, the clothing is a good, not a lot of people mentioned that, and thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, the clothing is a very good example. So the majority of Hasidic communities, specifically within a specific sect, wear today. That didn't really exist before the war at all. It mostly happened after the war. So the past like 60 years, kind of like you have this homogenous like dress code. Every community has like a slightly different dress code, specifically on weekends and holidays. I can tell which sect someone belongs to just by what they're wearing. While the person that you saw dancing, in this case, it's the bride's grandfather, but also the Rabbi, the supreme leader of the community, they tend to wear a bit more colored garments. And like there's a few things that are uniquely kind of considered royal, like the velvet stripes. I don't know if you picked up on that on his kind of like, which is supposed to look like, I don't know, to me, it looks more feminine than masculine, which is a whole other conversation about gender. But he actually had really good taste. Like some rabbis wear like colored stuff that look gross. His always looked really beautiful. Anyway, yes, and then you have the bride. So thank you for that. Okay, I see a few hands, but go ahead.
So one thing that I noticed was similar to what you were saying about the role of men being the more active ones. Like even here, the woman was standing very still and not moving, and the man was the one who was coming forward and coming back and dancing. And you couldn't see any reaction. I'm just imagining as probably a 17 or 18-year-old, girl, how scary that experience must be to be observed and as an introvert by like a crowd of people.
Well, thank you for that reflection. Yeah, so the bride isn't moving, and that is not just true. So most Hasidic weddings, let me just say something. Most Hasidic weddings don't have thousands of people. A few hundred, yes, because they're big families, but not a few thousand. This is the equivalency of a royal wedding. And I always used to remember as a child, and we would always talk about that when someone kind of would marry into certain parts of my family where they would do weddings like this, we would feel bad for the brides. In this specific case, though, I know who that bride was and who the wedding. Well, by now, some of her kids are already married. Actually, I would assume most of her kids, but at least I know some of her kids are already married. But she kind of grew up with this. In this case, she was a royal child, so to speak. The Rebbe's granddaughter, she knew from a really young age this was going to happen. So perhaps it's a bit less scary. But yes, she's not moving, and that is the case for every Hasidic bride. Most Hasidic weddings outside of Chabad, not going to go into that right now, but most Hasidic weddings have that same custom. And I've been to hundreds of Hasidic weddings, between my dad having 10 siblings, my mom having 8, most of them having 10 plus kids. We always had weddings, and this is how it always looks. Let me take two more hands. Let me take these comments, and then I will explain a bit more. Emily.
Well, I think similar to what others were saying, that she just didn't seem like she was an active participant at all, almost like she was on display. And that was her role, just to be on display, but not actually participating in something that you think she should be an active participant in, since it is her wedding. So that was just very striking.
Thank you. Yes, and Tracy.
So speaking to the leash, I saw it, to me, it felt ceremoniously like he initially was in control of her. He held her and he was releasing her to someone else, giving the leash away. So she was no longer his property, she would be the property of someone else.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. And I do want to say one of the things that I do like about even Hasidic weddings compared to many other weddings I've seen, specifically Christian ones, we don't really have that whole concept of giving away, while it exists biblically a bit and in some ways, but by Jewish law, a dad doesn't really own an adult child. Meaning, even by the basics of the law, a dad can be like, you can't force a woman to get married. A parent can't force a woman to get married. I know many fundamentalist Christian communities do have that from a kind of like legalistic religious perspective that doesn't really exist in Judaism. So the whole concept of giving away it's not really what's going on. So let me explain. Emily and Samantha, I see your hands, but I want to move ahead. So keep it maybe for later, but thank you for raising your hand. So what's really happening here is a good example of gender roles and sexuality. So obviously gender roles, you already saw it. The bride is barely moving. It's not just that. So an average Hasidic wedding, for the most of the wedding, men and women are either in separate rooms or in one room, but divided by a wall. During that time, the men dance on their own, the women dance on their own, but even then, it's totally acceptable, for example, for the woman to watch the men. It is not acceptable for the men to observe the woman. However, what we saw, the second part of the video, is the final part of a Hasidic wedding. Usually happens at around midnight or after that. So it's like usually like 6 or 7 hours into a wedding. Hasidic weddings are relatively long. And so it's based on like mystic traditions and whatever. I'm not going to go into explain exactly, but ultimately what happens is it's 3 sides men, 1 side women. But it's not just separated and extremely unequal. It is also that the men are the ones dancing, whatever is the person dancing directly with the bride, while the women are simply observing. Now, from a purely religious and like legalistic, like from Jewish law perspective, the specific video that I showed you is the bride dancing with her biological grandfather. Even according to the most strict interpretations, they are 100% allowed to hold hands and dance in public. Many religious Jews have this custom of not touching someone from the opposite sex, but when you're related to them biologically, like sisters, siblings, parents, grandparents, grandkids, they're 100% allowed, yet it is considered culturally taboo in many communities. The reasoning behind a lot of these things, a lot of this gender segregation, ultimately also comes down to the way they perceive sexuality. Women are sexual objects with absolutely no sexual desires or agency, while men are not sexualized, they are not attractive or sexual objects, but they have extreme sexual desires that they cannot control. I obviously don't believe a word of what I just said, but that is how the Hasidic community perceives it. Meaning that's how they treat it. That ends up controlling so many things in society, like the extreme gender segregation. In addition to like roles of the patriarchy, it takes gender segregation to an extreme. So, and it goes beyond just services. Yes, all Orthodox Jewish services are separated men and women. In Hasidic circles specifically, it's not just separated. The women, if they have a tent, if their women's section is a 10 the size of the men's section, that is big. And once again, they don't, like the people leading the service would never pay attention to them. You just go with it. You go with the flow and the women are observing. But the same will be true for every gathering, every community gathering, in many places, even families, like in my family, if it's anything more than the nuclear family. So like even like going to my grandparents for a holiday where there was first cousins, the men and women are in separate rooms. I want to bring this home though for a second. It's very easy for many people to look on this and to write it off as, oh my God, these crazy fundamentalists, what is wrong with them? Women are not sexual. Like, why do they perceive gender segregation, gender roles in such a radical way? Even for me, it would be very easy for me to look on that and be like, okay, thank goodness I'm out of there. I have nothing to do with these people anymore. The reality is, and it's one of the things that shocked me most after I left the community I grew up in and became part of, call it whatever you want, New York society. I went to one of the most progressive schools, at least nominally progressive schools in the country. And one of the things that shocked me most was to realize that the Hasidic community and many other fundamentalist communities don't live in a bubble. And that is something that I think both Hasidic people and outsiders something want to disagree with. Oh, these people live just in a bubble and we have nothing to do with that. The reality is that these same ideas of gender and sexuality impact each and every one of us. I studied, let me give a few examples. I studied political science in college, and for a few years, until fairly recently, I worked most of my time, I worked with candidates running for office, or, well, usually, I did some internships with elected officials and then with candidates running for office, almost exclusively women running for office in the New York area. Everything from city council to Congress. One of the things that I realized is that every woman who ever ran for office has at some point been asked the question how she balances her family life with work. That is true whether she is married or not, if she's 20 or 60, if she has kids or not. The only time I personally heard a man being asked the question was a gay man who was married and had kids, which is talk so much about sexism, and I'm not gonna in like what we call heteronormative culture. I'm not saying it never happens, but I think we all know, and it goes not just for politicians, it goes for CEOs and everywhere. There's a certain assumption of certain gender roles, and similar with sexuality. In the vast majority of US states and in countries around the world, if a woman gets assaulted, and I'm not even talking physical assault, sexual assault, I'm talking an assault, robbed, like assaulted physically, even if it's not sexual. Well, obviously it exists when it's sexual, but even when it's not sexual. She can be put on the stand, or a defense lawyer can start asking questions about what she was wearing, which kind of makeup she was doing. Maybe she did something to entice her attacker. I think a lot of people know that that exists by sexual assault. I was surprised to learn that it exists with everything. There's no law. I mean, I think some states have started making laws, but at least until fairly recently, there was no laws anywhere preventing these kind of line of questioning. And most people saw it as, yes, well, you should watch what you're wearing. Our whole culture of modesty, which also shocked me to realize how strongly it exists, specifically educators. I'm sorry if I'm stepping over my line here, but the way so many even progressive places in schools, specifically in high schools, try to enforce certain rules are subconsciously guided by that mentality. This is the same mentality of gender roles and the same with sexuality. That it's ultimately a woman's responsibility to protect men's desires, that maybe you asked for it, even when we don't say it in that many words. So I just wanted to say, I didn't just show the video to tell you about my own personal background. Yes, that was a big part of it, but also because I was really disappointed, so to speak. I'm not sure what I was expecting. I knew that the world is not a utopia when I left the Hasidic community, don't get me wrong. But the kind of sexism and the way we see gender, the way we see sexuality was quite surprising for me. And I think I have a responsibility to maybe bring that in, look on that. You look on a video like that, you pick up, and I saw it, and the people who spoke up, you all picked up that mentality and reality of gender and sexuality. And the same comes with the LGBTQ community. I mentioned the video that I showed that in the Hasidic community, the LGBT community doesn't exist. I sometimes wish I had an elementary school teacher who was phobic or transphobic. Because I don't know, tell me that trans people are terrible, because at least it would have meant that I knew trans people existed. I didn't know the word transgender. I didn't know there were other people who felt the way I felt until I got online for the first. When I was a teenager, he was convinced that I was gay, which wasn't necessarily wrong. Maybe the wrong.
Abby, your video.
Did I froze?
You did freeze.
Sorry.
Yes.
My frozen.
Yep.
Sorry, is it better now?
Yes.
Am I back? I'm sorry about that. My computer keeps connecting to a 2G internet instead of 5G, and it ends up making trouble. I'm really sorry about it. Where did I get cut off? What was the last thing you all heard?
A teacher in high school?
Yes. As I mentioned, I didn't know that trans people existed. My dad didn't know that even though he thought I was gay when I was a teenager, he didn't know that transgender people existed until I came out to him. It is a community that made me realize that there's very solid roles and norms, yet the same exists. The reality is that if you meet a man that you don't know and they tell you they're engaged, most people subconsciously just assume that it's to a woman. And the same the other way around. And I'm talking even people who are fully accepting, fully embracing. And if I have to say, let's call that lesson number 2 or 3, I don't know what other parts I've already said that could come in really handy for educators. But that part of not assuming anything about gender roles and about sexuality, it's important for everyone, and it's even more important for educators. I know I spent 4 years teaching most at Hebrew schools, but I have worked with middle school kids, I've worked with high school kids. The most important thing we can do is stop assuming. And we need to think about it consciously, because even I find myself, we live in a society where these are the gender roles, these are the roles of sexuality, and even some of the most legitimately progressive people, people who really want to accept everyone, far too often fall into that trap. Now, I want to share 2 more things, and then we'll take some questions. Sorry, 2 more topics, and then it's going to be a bit quicker than a few minutes, but a bit longer than a few minutes. But I want to share a few texts. Now, I know I was not invited here to give you all a Jewish lesson. I am a rabbi, so I have a hard time avoiding that. But so I'm not sharing any of these texts because I care about how religious or not religious any of you are in any religion. The only but the only constant thing that I do as a member of the clergy was something called Sacred Space that a friend of mine who grew up Mormon, along with a Muslim friend of mine, co-founded, which is a space for women and non-binary people of all religious and non-religious backgrounds to come together. That is the only thing that I believe in outreach in. I don't believe in outreach and getting people to be more or less religious. So I'm not sharing that to be like, oh, look how cool my religion is. That's not what I'm here for. I want to share 3 texts because of the power that I find in them, the power that they have. And obviously, yes, I am educated as a rabbi, and I am very proud of them. And they give me a lot of pride as a queer Jew. But I just want to make sure that none of you are thinking that I'm here trying to change your beliefs or anything like that. So before I share the first one, I want you all to open the chat box. Right? Everyone has access to the chat box, right? You could either write it to everyone or just to me. In a minute, I'm going to ask you for a number. Now, don't give me any explanations. Just give me a number of how many genders or gender identities you think traditional Judaism, so I'm talking Judaism specifically. If you don't know anything about Judaism, think the Bible. Whatever it is, the Bible, or whatever it is, Talmudic texts, which are the 6th century rabbinic law codes, how many genders you think they recognize. And just put a number, don't give me any explanations here. Okay, I'm loving it, very engaging. I should always talk to educators. Sometimes on Zoom, you need to like pull stuff from people by force. Okay, Aura saying 7, and I'm gonna guess a few other people who are maybe educated, Jewish-wise, gonna say, but most people I'm seeing are saying 2. I got a 3. Shauna Stein, damn, love your last name. I saying 7 in the Talmud, thank you for that. Megan Kaplan saying 7. I really don't like stereotyping people by their names, but I'm getting a feeling that everyone who says a number above 2 is Jewish. Correct me if I'm wrong. So most people say 2. I got some 3s. I got a 12 from Allison Jones. I would love to, well, we're not gonna have enough time, but get my email from Azara. I want to talk more about that. It's a fascinating answer, and not necessarily right or wrong, but I wanna talk more about that. We got an 8 from Jane, and then most of you, unsurprisingly, are saying 2. Again, I'm not gonna read through all of them, but the vast majority of you are saying 2. Not surprising, but here's what I wanna say. I think one of the things that as educators, many of us know is to never tell people that they are wrong, you know? I really believe that in many ways, that specifically when it comes to education, every opinion is valid. I'm not gonna say I take no pleasure in saying what I'm about to say because I kind of do, but I'm sorry to say that every answer below 6 is 100% wrong. This is not a progressive interpretation of Jewish law. It is not some modern concept that someone came up in the 20th century. By simple and basic definitions, there's already at least 6, I think it's more like 8, depending on how you interpret different things. It could be anywhere between 6 and 10, which I've seen. Already in the Bible, we already see it's mentioned several times, these different identities, and specifically in rabbinic literature later. And I'm not just talking about gender as in what genital someone has. We're talking gender roles in the context of what obligations someone has to society, what commandments someone is obligated to do, even some places in the rabbinic literature, how someone should dress, and so on. The reason I feel this is so important to share is because forget about religion for a second. I want to have someone, can I get a volunteer to read this text that's on the screen right now? Just unmute yourself or raise your hand.
An androgynous is like a man in some ways and like a woman in some ways, like both a man and a woman in some ways, and like neither a man nor a woman in some ways. Rabbi Meir says androgynous is a gender category of its own because the rabbis could not decipher whatever they are, a man or a woman. However, a tumtum is not so, as at times they are fully male and at times they are fully female, but we cannot tell which.
So I'm going to ignore the Greek here for a second, like literally tumtum and androgynous, that the words that they're using are Greek. Exactly what they're talking about is slightly disputed, probably something we would call intersex today. That's not why I wanted to share this. Just look on specifically that first quote. Some people are sometimes male, sometimes female, maybe both, and maybe none. And then Rabbi Meir, wow, such a radical liberal, I don't know who influenced them. Some people just are non-binary, don't even fit on the gender binary altogether. If I would create a meme, or like, I don't know if any of you give like quizzes to your students that are like, who said what? If I would put that text, you know, some people are sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes both, sometimes none, and some people do not fit on this binary altogether. And I would ask you, is this a 2nd century text or a 20th century text? I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that the vast majority of people are going to say this is 20th century. Forget about religion for a second. To me, this gives me a lot of pride as a queer person, as a Jewish person, as a rabbi, as a queer Jew, a lot of pride that this text exists. But just stop for a second and think this was written in the 2nd century. There's a lot of academic discourse exactly when the Bible was written, you know? The dates range anywhere between 2500 to 3500, even older texts. Pretty much everyone agrees that the Mishnah, which is the first part of the Talmud, was written, codified in the 2nd or 3rd century the latest. It's not the only example of a text like that. We're running out of time, so I'm going to jump ahead a bit. But you got this text. It's a 13th century poem from a Jewish poet, a medieval Jewish poet. Once again, just focusing on the bold part. What an awful fate for my mother that she bore a son.
Special area features.
Someone is unmuted. Okay, sorry. What an awful fate for my mother that she bore a son. Cursed be the one who announced to my father, it's a boy. That is followed by a prayer. Who would then turn me from a man to a woman? I will bear and suffer until I die and wither in the ground. This is someone writing in the 13th century. One of the things that I hear a lot of times that people say about the LGBTQ community is that it is influenced by like modern media or like Hollywood or liberal or whatever. Like, I don't have to give you, I assume many of you have heard all of these reasoning on like why the LGBTQ people exist and how it's like someone corrupting our children, blah, blah, blah. This is someone writing in the 13th century. Once again, yes, it's a Jewish text, it's a poet, but this is not really a religious text at all. It is simply someone writing in the 13th century. One other example that I want to share. This is from someone, a Hasidic master, writing the 1st generation of Hasidic Judaism. He passed away in 1786, so we're talking, this was written somewhere around the mid-18th century. To me, this is very personal. So the screenshot in Hebrew that is on the right, that is, I showed that to my dad when I came out to him. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just the part in the bubble. At times, a male will be in a female body. To me, again, this is a religious text, but also this is an 18th century text, a line that far too many people have told me personally, and I've heard far too many people tell other people that it's new ideas. I want to bring this to the next part and the final part. I'm going to show one more video and then we're going to take questions. I hate tolerance with a passion. I hate tolerance. I tell people that tolerance is really good for lactose or nuts, or intolerance for lactose and nuts, and that is totally fine. Not for people. We need to move on when we think about the LGBTQ community. We need to move on from focusing, oh my God, you're gay? Oh, wow. Well, I still like you. I still love you. That's nice. We need to move on from that. We need to realize that people are beautiful, not in spite of who they are, but because of who they are. Someone being LGBTQ is cool and worthy of celebration, not just because it's maybe unique and exotic. It is because people being who they are, people coming out of the closet is a powerful experience. If we want the world to be a better place, one of the first things that we need is for people to be more authentic, for people to be able to live their life openly, and for us to realize that that is beautiful and worthy of celebration. When I just shared these texts that I showed you, and these are not the only ones, I've created whole curriculums that I've taught classes of, like, I once did a summer-long session of 3 hours each class focused on these texts with plus like 50 others of them. I didn't share it just to get into a very legalistic or like theological debate. I shared it because I think they offer us an opportunity to realize this is as old as humanity. Since people have created gender roles, since people have tried to put labels on our sexuality, there were people who did not fit into these boxes. And it gives us the opportunity to look on that, to look on our cultures and tradition, and create rituals to celebrate. I assume that many of you have heard of something called a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, which is what Jewish preteens or teenagers have at age of 12 or 13. Traditionally, a girl has a bat mitzvah, and a girl has a bar, and a boy has a bar mitzvah. Now, I'm here to tell you all today that I'm actually a super Jew, not because I'm educated as a rabbi, also not because I'm not really traditionally religious and do my own thing. I had a bar mitzvah, and then I had a bat mitzvah. I was lucky enough to have both, a lot of parties. It's really exciting. Why am I sharing this? I'm once again not trying to tell you all to become Jewish or to tell you all to become more or less religious. I'm sharing it because I think this is an example of how we can approach it. I have worked with, there's an organization called Trans Faith, which is a collection of clergy and lay leaders across religious denominations and movements and spectrum. You got Jews and Muslims and Christians and Hindus and Buddhists and Native African or Native American religions and people who are atheist and agnostic and everything in between, who come together, and we created, and many of us create rituals for whatever your culture is, for people to celebrate who they are. I'm going to show this video. This is only a few minutes from a half an hour long video. I'm not going to do the whole part. And then I will take some questions.
In our tradition, leaving Egypt wasn't an historical event alone. In our tradition, leaving Egypt was a personal, existential leaving as well. Whenever we leave a narrow place, a place of constriction, painful servitude, a place where we are not authentically who we are, that leave-taking, that transitioning is an exodus. It's a freedom walk. And so at this moment, we have risen, we have stood now in order to be in community with our very dear, dear, dear friend and member and teacher, who will make a blessing of transition and walk slowly through this space, this narrow space, to a place of Torah, to a place of reception, and to a place of new name. We turn to face.
Amen.
Amen. Nadai higonenam ufros chavivi onai et sukan shlomecha higonenam mufros chavivi onai et sukan shlomecha. Misha berach avotenu v'imotenu, men will one who blessed our ancestors. Bless this morning one who has come forward to receive a new name in our tradition, to be known by Israel, to be known amongst this community and all communities as Avigail Chava bat Menachem Mendel v'Chaya Shendel. Avigail Chava. May the merit of all of those who have walked from a narrow place into an expansive place be with you. May the signature of the one who is known as Emet, the one who is known as truth, be with you as you have now embraced, first to yourself and now in Kahal Rav, amongst those who love you and know you. Embrace the truth of who you are and the joy of who you are. Avigail.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asani b'tzalmo.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'achiyanu v'kiyimanu v'higiyanu lazman hazeh.
Amen.
I'm gonna wrap up here because I want to have some time to take questions. Adar, I will leave it up to you for how many questions we can take. I just wanted to put that up there. You can, as I always say, you can ask me anything. I don't have to answer everything, which I think is a good approach to questions. Also, if any of you feel like stalking me, I'm very stalkable in a good way. Feel free to check out social media. There's a link to get the book, which is easy to remember if any of you want. Yeah, I will leave that up for a minute and we'll take some questions.
I'd say we have about 10-ish minutes for questions.
Up to you. Can I, do you want to take them? Should I just take them directly? How are we doing this?
Take them directly.
Okay, let's do it then. So if you have a question, I think the best would be if you raise your hand through the, on the bottom right corner of your screen. There should be on the reaction, there's an option to raise your hand. So just do that and we'll unmute you. You can also put in the chat, but I think we would prefer, given that we don't have a lot of time, prefer to have people ask them directly. So if there is anyone who, if there's no questions, which would be very shocking to me, that's totally fine. Lisette, I don't want to mispronounce your name, so sorry if I did, but.
No, you did fine, thank you.
Okay.
I don't know if this question is too personal, but I was wondering as to the status of your wife after you left the community. Was she, was she allowed to remarry? I was just wondering. And do you have any contact with any of your family?
She was married 3 months after we got divorced.
Oh, wow, okay.
Kind of sad. It was another arranged marriage. It was all arranged marriages. I heard rumors she wasn't happy. I have no idea. Her family didn't let her talk to me ever since we got, the whole separation wasn't by choice. We actually got along. Her family stepped in and kind of physically locked her up. It's a long and messed up story. I will share it in my second book, hopefully. But yeah, so she was remarried right away. I think she has had 4 or 5 more kids. I'm not exactly sure. But yeah, it didn't really, I was blamed for everything. So it didn't really have an impact on her in any negative way.
Thank you.
Lynn, thank you. Is it Lynn or,
Lynn.
I don't want to mispronounce it. Is it Lynn?
Lynn.
Okay.
I watched your presentation and you were talking about as a young child, the first time you had to get your hair cut and how you were really, that was the first time that you realized and felt upset or have that memory. There was the debate about remembering to remember or remembering. So as an educator, how do we help children that are 5, 6, 7, or 8? What can we do to help them, to support them, to, as was so lovely said, embrace the truth of who they are and the joy of who they are? How can we help them?
Well, first and foremost, exactly what you just did is a really good first step. I wasn't lucky enough to have any educator to ask that question, or even my mom when, I'm not going to go into, and I don't want to spoil too much of the book, but she caught me taking matters into my own hand, quite literally, when I was 4 and didn't really pay attention even when I told her what I was feeling. So the first big step is to listen to kids. Here's what I want to say about kids. And I know a lot of people love to make controversy about it. I think it's quite simple, but anyway. In addition to, yes, obviously listening to kids, it's also important to know there's no one size fits all. Not everyone who is trans knew when they were 2 or 3 or 4 years old, even though a lot of academic and medical studies have shown that many kids do know even at such a young age. Everyone has their own journey. Ultimately, I think the best thing is to know the resources that are available. We do not expect every educator to know exactly what to do. It is totally fine if when a 4-year-old tells you, I'm a boy, I want to be a boy, I'm a girl, like same the other way around. It's totally fine if you're like, oh, I don't know what to do. It's very normal. As long as you know the resources and given that I assume most of you are in New Jersey, if not all of you, every major city, well, by now, all over across the US, believe it or not, even in the deep South, have LGBTQ support organizations specifically for children that you can reach out to. I think every school district has, or if not, they should have someone who knows, whatever it is, a child therapist or a social worker who understands these things, or someone that could give you basic ideas. I think a first reaction should never, that is one of the most important things for kids. I never worked with very young kids, but I do have a 9-year-old child, and I've worked with enough kids to know that one of the most important things is to never try to push it away. Never try to be like, are you sure? Or be like, oh, you're gonna grow out of it, even if you think it's a joke. Because to 4-year-olds, these things are not a joke. My mom kind of thought I was kidding or whatever when I was 4. And as a result, I never spoke to anyone ever again about it until I was 22. And it was not healthy. To me, it went to an extent when I was a teenager, I kept developing physical symptoms that came from gender dysphoria and depression. So I think knowing the resources, first and foremost, affirming, listening to them. No one is expecting the teacher to tell the kid, okay, here's a dress or here's something to wear. That is not listening and then reaching out to the people. Ultimately, anyone's decision of what is being done with the child and whatever it is, puberty blockers, which don't come into play anyway until 10 or 12 years old, or how they were dressed. I personally think that is up to the parents, assuming the parents are gender affirming. A therapist, which is very important, and that's one of the most important things. Try to get a children's therapist who understands, and not just a random children's therapist, but someone who understands. And again, every LGBTQ center organization could, if they don't have one, they can tell you who might be good in that area. And ultimately, it's up to a parent, to a doctor, and a social worker and a therapist to decide how that is being treated after that. Thank you. Okay. Jamie, you need to unmute yourself.
Do you have any advice for how to balance a student's needs while at the same time respecting the religious or cultural beliefs of his or her or their parents?
I wish that wasn't a problem. I so wished, but I obviously know that far too often it is. Obviously, yes. When there's religion involved, it gets sometimes a lot more complicated. I think ultimately very similar to what I said before, it boils down to making sure there's the right people involved. I personally know clergy and members of literally every religious community. I know Catholic priests who are, well, queer themselves and LGBTQ affirming. I've personally worked with people of literally every background. So I think a good starting point would be to get in touch with a member of that community, of that faith necessarily. It might not be the exact community that the parents are part of, that could guide you. There's no one size fits all. There's no one basic answer that you can pull out that works for every religion, and within a religion, within a movement, within a denomination, and frankly, within the same church or synagogue or temple, you're going to have different people, different families, different. So in such a case, it's very important to try to get zoom in as much as possible to the specific needs. I would say reach out to people who are part of that community directly or indirectly, who might know a lot more. Like, for example, if that happens with an Orthodox child, I personally know, I would know who to talk to. There's even an organization, it's called Eshel, that works specifically with Orthodox parents of LGBTQ kids. I know many other religious communities have that. So, for example, such an organization could be really helpful, and so on. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, did you want to say something else?
Oh, no, just thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Someone who doesn't have a name, but 992629.
Yeah,
thank
you. Sorry about that. When I tried to log on, it didn't give me an opportunity to put my name in. My name is Mira Septimus.
Okay.
First of all, I wanted to thank you so much for everything you spoke about, but I just also, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
You're still breaking up a bit.
Okay, I'm gonna switch devices actually real quick.
Okay, I will get. Can I get back to you in a minute?
Let me into the other device.
Of course.
Here.
Okay, we'll get back. We'll get back. Kate.
Hi. I apologize. I haven't read your book, Abby, but I don't know if you dealt with this, but I'm curious of how you kind of I think people that I know that have grown up in very fundamentalist religious families are often find it difficult to then negotiate their faith afterwards in a way that they can separate it from some of that trauma from that their childhood. So how did you kind of reconcile your relationship with Judaism? I don't know if that's a fair question to ask.
No, it is. It is. Well, first and foremost, it's a lifelong journey. I will say that. Many people, like for me, they were kind of like journeys happening simultaneously. Like I didn't leave the community because of gender and sexuality. I left because of religious reasons. I go into my book a bit of some of I think the reason I started questioning was kind of triggered by my identity, but it wasn't the only reason. It wasn't kind of like I left because I didn't, outside of my identity, I really didn't believe in that community theologically, philosophically, and in many other ways. For about 2 years or so after I left, I had something that one of my teachers today calls post-God traumatic disorder, which is, I don't know if it's a real thing or not, but it's definitely like I grew up with like God was that like boogeyman in the sky that's going to be really angry and it's going to send you to hell if you do X, Y, and Z. And I still tell people to this day, I don't believe in that God. If that is the God people believe in, then I would be a proud atheist. It took me a while, and we're running out of time, so I'm not going to go. It took me a really long time to kind of like figure out my own path, figure out the things that work for me. And now I'm very proud of my Judaism, very proud of the practices that I have personally chosen to embrace. Here's what I would say. Ultimately, everyone cherry picks. I think the big difference between people who have a more progressive approach to religion is that we know that picking and choosing what works for us is not just okay, it's beautiful. I personally believe that is worthy of celebrating, that we all, and like for me, like getting to that moment, that was the most important thing. Getting to the moment of realizing that I need to find things and customs and traditions that work for me. Regardless, first, for me, it was also really hard. Another struggle that I had was separating kind of this like purely intellectual, philosophical need from kind of like the spiritual and the emotional part. And kind of like being able to be like, I want to do this right now, and I don't care if the book that told me to do that was written by God or by people, or if it's totally messed up. To kind of like get to that point of really feeling comfortable with doing what works and doing what is healthy for you from a both emotional and spiritual perspective, and realizing that that is not just okay, but beautiful. That is a very short answer. I'm hoping one day to write a whole book just about that. So thank you for putting up. Adara, do we have time for more questions? Or
we have time for, I'd say, 2 more quick questions. And I know Mira was able to jump back on.
Oh.
So we'll start with her.
Are you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you so much. I'm sorry about that. I'm in school still, so I was a little I wanted to thank you first of all for sharing your story and giving us a lot of tools that will be helpful in generating conversations in our classroom. I just wanted to point out something important, being that we're in a diversity council right now, is that there is a very big difference between the Hasidic community and the ultra-Orthodox and the Orthodox community. And I think it's important to point out, especially for people who have said that they live near Lakewood and Williamsburg, most people are not Hasidic. And I think that's really important, that we shouldn't clump people together, that when you see, because there are parts of Judaism that are not Hasidic, but Orthodox, that do embrace divorce and embrace different genders and do embrace other things. And other, individuals and all different things. And I think it's really important, that we shouldn't categorize it in that way, because there really is a vast, many different types of people and many different Orthodox types of people. And I think that's really important to recognize that we see, like a man,
Thank you about that. And I also want to say, I don't know if you picked up on it. That's why I use Hasidic. When I talk about community, I say Hasidic all the time. I don't call Orthodox. They are, most Hasidic people are kind of Orthodox, albeit these two are not, like originally Hasidic people were not necessarily Orthodox. It's a very different conversation. But yes, I'm talking specifically, I would say, but even within the Hasidic community, there's some differences. I'm talking, so let's just make one major disclaimer. I'm talking about the community I was raised in, not talking about every religious community. I'm definitely not talking about every Jewish or even every, I would say not about every Orthodox community, but not even about every ultra-Orthodox community. There are many differences. I mean, even in the Hasidic world, like I mentioned ones like Chabad, I'm not going to go into that, but they are radically different culturally than the way I grew up. So what I'm sharing is specifically my own community. Culturally, surprisingly enough, one of the things that I learned in college is I had a classmate that grew up Amish, and culturally we got each other more than, like, we have more in common than. Stacy, can you mute yourself? Thank you. I realized that I had more in common with this girl who grew up Amish culturally, not religiously, but culturally, than I did with the modern Orthodox community, the big Orthodox community of Columbia. So yes, thank you so much, Mira, and that is definitely accurate. Did we have, I thought I saw one other hand. If there's one more we can take, otherwise I believe our time is up.
There was one question that came up in the chat, and a few people sent me, that had to do with whether or not you've seen your family since leaving the community.
Good question. Well, as I mentioned in my book, when I came out to my dad, after he made some very sexist and weird remarks, he ultimately said he's never going to talk to me again. For 5 years, he kind of stuck to it. I tried really hard. I would constantly text him. My mom doesn't even have, so first he didn't let me talk to my mom. I wanted to talk to my mom. He didn't even let me. Weird and messed up that he gets to control that, but he does. My mom doesn't have any text messages, so I can't even text her. When I called, she wouldn't pick up. But then I used to text my dad almost every Friday, and he never responded until the day before Passover on Friday, a few weeks ago. I spoke to both of my parents for the first time in a very long time. It was a very weird conversation, felt almost scripted on their end. but I think it was a start. I'm still not welcomed at anything family-wise in any way or form, but it's the start. I have a very good relationship with two of my siblings. Well, one brother I'm really close with, and then a sister and a brother-in-law that I respond to my texts sometimes. And then I have about 10 or so first cousins that I'm close with. Now, here's what I would say one final thing about that. The way I like to approach it. Yes, if I want to compare it to how many don't speak to me, then I have 10 siblings and hundreds of first cousins who wouldn't speak to me. But on the other side, I have 2 siblings and about 10 first cousins, most of them still Orthodox and still Hasidic, who I do have a good relationship with. I have some extended family. On my dad's side, I have a whole branch of like second and third cousins that were totally secular, live in Israel, who I became really close with. So I focus on the family that I do have. And hey, 2 siblings, 10 cousins. Most people my age don't even have that. So I'm good. Well, not really, but I mean, I think I like to focus on what I do have as opposed to what I don't have. Yeah, I think we're going to end here. Thank you all so much. Again, Adara has my email. If there's anything specific that comes up, if you want to get in touch, please do. As I said before, I'm on social media. It's Abby Stein, ABBYCHAVASTEIN, on like Twitter, Instagram, even TikTok, which I never use, but you're welcome to check it out. And then obviously Facebook, and the link again for the book for anyone. If you don't remember, it's very simple: tinyurl.com, right? /Becoming Eve. And you will find many links to buy it at local stores, to buy it at national sellers, and so on.
And I will make sure to send that information to everybody afterwards. And if there's any questions that come up or that people sent me directly that we couldn't address today, I will be sure to send those to Abby, and hopefully we'll get you some answers. So
I can't commit to answering everything, but I will try my best.
And I promise not to give people your phone number, because there's a lot of people here who probably want to call you and be like, hey.
Okay.
A couple of quick things. Was your bat mitzvah or your naming ceremony at Romemu?
Romemu, spelled ROMEMU, for anyone who's curious, ROMEMU.org. They are one of the most progressive communities, not just progressive Jewish communities, progressive communities, period. It is really a place where your gender identity or your sexuality has no negative impact on your place in society and in participating in the community. Fully egalitarian, very, very embracing of people of every race, every ethnic, every religious or non-religious background. Believe it or not, there are some people who do not even identify as Jewish who are kind of parts of the community. So you don't have to be part of anything specific to at least enjoy. By now, everything they're doing is virtual, so you're all welcome to check it out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And just a round of applause for you.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
What's your Instagram name again? I lost it when you were saying it.
I will put it in the chat.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you.
Instagram and Twitter are both the same.
Wonderful. And what I'm going to recommend is that all of the teachers who are here, and anybody that wants to stay for the second part of the program where we're going to be doing some pedagogy, take 2 minutes, go use the washroom, go get something to drink, and then let's be back here in a couple of minutes for anyone who needs to. Amazing.
I'm going to log off, Adara.
Okay.
Thank you all. We'll
be in touch. Thank you so much for everything. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Friends, everyone take a minute. We're doing a lot today. I appreciate it. I know it's a long day for all of us, but I think it's a worthwhile one. And, one thing, Mira, that you said that, really resonated with me is this idea of people being able to differentiate between communities. And I think that's something that we often struggle with. And even myself, oftentimes, at the university, I get seen or approached as, the Jewish staff member, the Jewish faculty member, and I'll get asked things that I don't have answers to. And I have to remind others that I'm Jewish, I identify as Jewish, but I'm not a religious scholar. I don't necessarily have a religious training. If you have a question about me, and about how I practice Judaism, how I identify, how I observe, I can answer that. But I cannot speak for others in a different denomination or another community that I'm not familiar with. So really, thank you for bringing that up, because I think we all come from so many different places and experiences that, again, you have two people from the same group and they're going to view the world differently. So thank you.
You're very welcome. I just felt that a lot of the questions that were coming up are sometimes questions I ask also, because many of the customs in the Hasidic world are not any of our customs at all, and they're very foreign to me. And I don't identify with, I don't identify in that group. I'm not a part of that group. So I see who they are and I know their customs and I know what they do, but I'm not Hasidic. So, it's very different for me as well. But I think for people, when you look at people and you say, oh, this person looks like that, or that person looks like that, it's easy, as you said, to just put somebody in a cluster with everybody else.
And, even I think like the community I came from, somebody asked me on the call the other day about Jewish communities in Canada. And I stared at them and I said, I can tell you about the community that my parents belong to. But I can't speak. And someone came on and they started telling me, what it looked like. And I went, I don't think that's correct. I said, where did you get that information from? Are you a member of that community? Do you have, a direct tie? They said, no, it's from what I've read. I went, okay. And that's, So I think it's important that we also know that we are a community here and we don't expect everybody to know everything. But if you have questions, about another group, about another faith, ethnicity, gender, sexual experience, ask, because there may be somebody in our community that will be able to support you. And if not in this group, then we will find somebody that can. So I think we are going to get started. David and Jackie, are you both here?
David is here.
David is here and Jackie's here. Excellent. So I think we're going to get started. And if people are, still taking care of things, that's okay. They'll come back, when they can, but let's get started.
Can we just make sure that I am now co-hosting? Because I'm not sure that I am at this moment. If Spencer is in the house. Okay, thank you. Great, Spencer.
Welcome back, everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing a dear friend and colleague, David Schwartz. David Schwartz is coming to you with a BA from the University of Vermont, an MA from Rutgers, and an MA from NYU. He has a 30-year career, or had a 30-year career in public education in New Jersey, and 10 years working for the nonprofit organization Facing History and Ourselves. The past 2 years, he's been doing educational consulting with his consulting group, Creative Options for Progressive Educators. After 40 years of teaching, supervising, and nonprofit work, he felt it was time to use what he learned to help teachers and supervisors experience the joy of educating. He now offers creative options for progressive educators to help create schools that serve as sites for democracy, working towards social justice. The goal is to provide professional development, mentoring, and training that uncovers effective teaching strategies and enriched content. It is also a goal to interrupt structural racism in schools and the establishment of educational practices that provide equity for all students. Welcome, David Schwartz.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you all. It's great to be with you. I've done so much work. One of the journeys that Jackie did not mention that I have been on is I've done a lot of work with the Diversity Council when I was a teacher, including being president of the Diversity Council at one point in time. So this is a place where I feel very much at home, and it's great to work with all of you folks here today. I think you probably are with me in feeling very much moved by the words of Rabbi Stein and what she was talking about. Today, I'm going to bring you to sort of a different place. We have a mandate in the state of New Jersey to teach LGBTQ history, and I'm really going to talk about how we can meet that mandate and some of the things that we can do as teachers to get that work done. I'm going to leave my space here for a moment and move to some shared slides that I'd like you to see. So just give me a second to set that up, and be patient as I move to the shared screen. Just a word about my organization, because it came up, Adair asked me the question, where's the name come from? In picking a name, Creative Options really gets to my incredible belief that there really is an art to teaching and that we are artists. And sometimes we get so sucked into the data-driven world of education that we forget that artistic part and the need to be creative and to keep thinking and reinventing. The progressive educators part of this is really going all the way back to John Dewey, who founded a progressive education movement in the 1880s, really based upon the idea of educating everyone and making sure that all of the newly incoming immigrants in the 1880s were getting educated, were getting schooled, and were part of the process of becoming part of the American fabric. So that's the name that I have chosen. This is us here today, teaching LGBTQ history. And because this program went over so long, I'm going to give you my contact information now, because by the end of the program, when I usually give contact information, you might not be with us. We were supposed to wrap up today at 6:30, but this will go and extend beyond 6:30. So if you would like to connect with me, my email address is given here. You've got my phone number. You can follow me on Facebook and also on Twitter. I will probably say some very lovely things about all of you if you want to follow me, Facebook and Twitter. And you can also check out my webpage, www.co4pe.com, if you need more information about the work that I do. So just a moment for some contact information, because as I said, you may not be with us, unfortunately, when we finish this program. And some guiding questions that will lead us tonight in the work that we're doing. How can we begin to create engaging lessons in LGBTQ plus history for our students? And what are some teaching strategies and resources that will allow us to engage students in learning LGBTQ plus history? To begin this conversation, I want to introduce you to this beautiful video from Margalit Schindler. It's an introduction to the queer community because it provides us with some definitional language. Usually students are in need of this, educators are in need of this, some of you may be in need of this. This moves very, very quickly, so I'll tell you that. But because it's on YouTube, you can take a look at it and watch it again. I also want to mention that I provided you with a list of terminologies from the mailing that was sent out to you by Adara, and it's a list of terms from GSAFE. You could take a look at that as well, which will help you with some of this information. So let's just quickly play this piece by Margalit.
Definitions floating around in the media, it can be hard to dissect what it all means. So this brief video will introduce you to some basic concepts. Okay, there's a lot to get through. First, the LGBTQ+ acronym. Let's break that down. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, ally. Now, all of these words deal with one of 4 key traits every person, queer or not, has. Biological sex is the physical anatomy with which you were born. Gender identity is the personal feeling and conceptualization of one's own gender on the spectrum between male and female. Sexual orientation is the gender to which a person is attracted, either romantically or sexually, in relation to their own. Gender expression is how a person chooses to outwardly show their gender identity. In simple terms, biological sex, what you have, gender identity, what you feel, sexual orientation, who you love, gender expression, how you look and act. Okay, we just broke down the acronym and we talked about the 4 traits. Now let's put them together. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and asexual refer to sexual orientation. Intersex refers to differences in biological sex, which can also be related to being transgender, and both of those are related to gender identity. Queer is an umbrella term used by most of the community to refer to anyone who identifies as part of the community. Questioning refers to people who are, you guessed it, still questioning their sexuality or gender. Allies are non-queer folk who support and love the queer community. Now, the first idea to talk about is that of a spectrum. The LGBTQ+ community widely accepts that the four aforementioned traits are all on a spectrum, a scale between two opposite points. Traits can fall on either extreme or anywhere in between. All right, let's jump in and start with terms relating to gender identity. First, biological sex. The extremes on this spectrum are biological male and female. These are determined mainly by hormones and organs. For males, this means testosterone, a penis, testes, and secondary sex characteristics like body and facial hair and a lower voice. For females, this means estrogen, a vagina, and the internal reproductive organs for pregnancy. Female secondary sex characteristics include breasts, wider hips, and a higher voice. Intersex is the term used to describe people whose combination of hormones, internal sex organs, and genitals do not fit typical binary notions of male or female bodies. Gender, another spectrum, is the scale between boy and girl. Boys may use masculine pronouns, he, him, his, and feel masculine. Girls use she, her pronouns and feel feminine. Anyone who identifies outside the gender binary falls under the umbrella term of genderqueer. Halfway between the extremes is gender neutral. This means someone who identifies as neither a man nor a woman. They often choose neutral pronouns, they, them, their, or a variation of the invented pronouns z, zer, z. Someone who is gender fluid may identify differently at different times. A bigender person lives their life at both extremes at different times, living both as a man and as a woman. With both gender fluid and bigender people, it is important to listen and respect the appropriate pronoun for the situation. Agender people don't identify with any gender and often use gender-neutral pronouns. So, we already established that gender identity is the gender you feel inside. When your internal gender identity matches your born biological sex, that's called cisgender. If they don't match, transgender. Transgender people experience gender dysphoria, or the uncomfortable feeling that their mind and body don't match. Often, trans people will choose to transition, using hormone replacement therapy and/or various surgeries to change their bodies to match their identity. It is never okay to ask a trans person where they are in their transition. If they want you to know, they'll tell you. Mind-body alignment also lies on a spectrum. Gender expression is how people choose to show their gender to the outside world. This refers to the ways in which we each manifest masculinity or femininity. It is usually an extension of gender identity. Each of us expresses a particular gender every day: the clothes we wear, how we style our hair, or even the way we stand. Drag kings and queens are people who explore gender as an art form. Their cross-dressing is a form of gender expression, but you cannot assume anything about their gender identity or sexual orientation based on how they choose to dress. Speaking of sexual orientation, that's our last spectrum, and it refers to whom you are attracted. On one end, we have heterosexual, or attraction to someone of the opposite gender. Opposingly, there is homosexual, or attraction to the same gender. In between is bisexual, attraction to both genders. Pansexuality is attraction to all genders, including those that lay outside the binary. Someone who is asexual is not attracted to any gender. Attraction can be broken down even further into both romantic and sexual. One is an emotional attraction, the other is physical. These attractions do not always have to align. For example, someone can be panromantic, emotionally attracted to all genders, but asexual, not physically attracted to any gender. There are several other, more nuanced prefixes: demi, scolio, poly, to name a few. Other genders such as third gender and two-spirit also exist. Some of these identities can be confusing and hard to understand if you've never been exposed to them before. But if a person defines themselves in a way that is new to you, it is okay, even important, to respectfully ask what that identity means to them. These are just a few of some offensive and hurtful terms that are used to describe some people in the LGBT community. These terms are mostly old-fashioned and are often used out of ignorance rather than malice. However, they can all be slurs used maliciously on purpose to hurt people's feelings. But the biggest message you should take away from this video is the importance of letting someone define their own gender and sexuality. Respect their pronouns, respect their chosen name, respect their appearance, and respect their choice in partners. Share this video on your favorite social media platform and spread the word. Use these new vocab words to define yourself. I am a gay, cisgender female. Who are you?
Okay, so that went very, very quickly. But as I said, you've got that list of G-safe terminologies that you can take a look at. What I'd like you to do is just spend a moment, if you would, and do a little journaling. What are you thinking about after viewing the video and reviewing the handout terms? Just take a moment to reflect on that. I'm going to leave this shared screen and move back to our Zoom room. And when you complete your writing, I'd love to hear a couple of your voices, some things that you're thinking about after viewing that video, and also taking a look at some of those pieces. So if you can just put your hands up in your little Zoom boxes, I'd be happy to hear from some of you. Jamie Saki.
Hi, so I'm part of a club, also with Morgan, who's here, and it's called Upstanders. And part of what we did was use some of this terminology to educate our student population. And the students were, even though they're of like South Asian descent, and a lot of them had never encountered any of this terminology before, they were really appreciative of learning more about it. It helped to normalize some of these things that they've been hearing sort of on social media platforms, having sort of a skewed sense of what things mean. So just a straightforward educating of them helped them to process some of these, complex topics, especially for their age.
Other for that, Jamie. I apologize for my dog deciding to enter into our conversation, but thank you for that. That's helpful. Yeah. Any other reaction to this? Okay, so I just want you to be aware that it is out there. You can view it again. May be useful. I've had a lot of teachers, particularly teachers who teach psychology, sociology, who said that they've used this in the classroom with their students. It's been helpful to them. So you can continue to think about it. One of the things that I do want to mention, and I'm going to go back to my my slides again.
I actually had a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't see you, but you can
Oh,
shout it out. Go ahead.
Turn my camera off. I was just wondering, there were so many terms of which I was not aware. Are some of those relatively new as we learn more about how people identify? I was overwhelmed by how many terms there were, and it was intriguing, but I just don't know them all yet.
So thank you for that question. And you have foreshadowed where we're going, because here's my next slide. Headline: you don't have to know all of these terms to meet the state mandate for teaching LGBTQ plus history. And as you suggest, terms continue to change, emerge, and are recreated as we move forward in time. So we're gaining better insight on all this, and better names, better ways of identifying the various groups who we have in our society. So yes, this is a journey for all of us. So learning all of this is good for us. But the other side of that is, as we are in the learning phase, you don't need to know all of this stuff to be able to teach LGBTQ history well. So thanks for that question. And I just want to say this also. I wanted to wait till that that video ran to identify my pronouns. I use he, him, and his, so you can use those pronouns when addressing me. Moving forward with this, I thought it would be important to show you what the New Jersey state mandate actually looks like. This is what the state has passed. If you just scroll down with me to letter C, number 1, and I'm going to read this for you. You can follow along. A Board of Education shall include instruction on the political, economic, and social contributions of persons with disabilities and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in an appropriate place in the curriculum of middle school and high school students as part of the district's implementation of New Jersey student learning standards. So one thing I'm going to say off the bat is I'm not going to talk at all about students, about teaching disability history, though that's out there, but I am going to stick just to the LGBT history for this presentation. And the other thing that I want to mention is that this is specifically for middle and high school students. So if you're an elementary school teacher, yes, you should be getting your kids ready to think about and talk about these issues, but it is not a mandate at this point. Second piece, number 2, if you'll follow along with me, a Board of Education shall have policies and procedures in place pertaining to the selection of instructional materials to implement the requirements of Section 1 of this Act. When adopting instructional materials for use in the schools of the district, a Board of Education shall adopt inclusive instructional materials that portray the cultural and economic diversity of society, including the political, economic, and social contributions of persons with disabilities and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people where appropriate. This act shall take effect immediately and shall first apply to the 2020-2021 school year. So we are here. This is a mandate that affects you now, and a lot of latitude given to boards of ed because they are the ones who are given the ability to decide what kinds of materials and curricular work that you're going to be doing related to this. So keep that in mind also, that this is heavily leans on your boards of ed to implement. So then the question becomes, where do we start with our conversation around this history? I gave you a handout and asked you to read prior to coming to the event this evening, a small introductory piece from Michael Bronsky, who is the author of an excellent text called A Queer History of the United States. As you dive into teaching LGBT history, I really recommend this book as a good partner for you. What I'm going to do is set you up into a pair share group in a moment so that you can actually talk to each other. You've been sitting and listening for a very, very long time. I think you'll find it refreshing to be able to speak. Before we get there, though, I'd like you to just copy the 3 questions I have here, which you will focus on when you meet with your partner. 2 of the questions come from the article that Bronsky asks. The first question: how do we uncover and explicate the past so that it brings new understandings to popular, cultural, and scholarly pursuits alike? And then the second question: how will this history resonate with our understanding of our own contemporary and historic lives? And then the third question, which I've created for you: what in this passage is new for you, surprising, presents challenges, and or provides important, interesting content? So take a moment to scribble those 3 questions down. Then I will stop my screen share and then move you all into some partnerships. Okay. And, you know, what I think I'm going to do here is instead of putting you in partnerships, I think I'm going to put you in little groups of 3 because people are moving in and out of here, and I want to make sure that you have at least 2. So to have at least 2, I'll put you in a group of 3, and hopefully that will work out for us. So let me do that for you. Set up the rooms. Let me just do my math correctly. Okay, and you can go to those rooms. Go to those rooms as soon as you can and focus on the conversation around those 4 questions. Or 3 questions.
David?
Yes.
Is it possible to add links to the articles here? For the folks, there's a few people who don't have them, who didn't receive them.
Okay.
I'm not able to do it through mine because it's in my regular email and this is the HRC's.
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't have the links available to me right now. I would normally be able to put them into the chat room, but I don't have them. But
I'm sure somebody in the group will have it.
yes, hopefully.
Hopefully we'll move people otherwise. That's all good.
Yes.
Great. Okay. And I'm guessing some of the people who are in this room are on their phones, joined in.
It seems like, because the folks who are here now, or they're not here because they're not showing themselves, and they may be logged on, but they might be cooking dinner for all we know. So
yep, happens.
That's why I went.
Yes, Charlotte likes to join the party. She doesn't like to be left out. We have a serious fear of missing out over here.
Okay, folks, so thank you so much and welcome back together again. I hope you had some good conversations in your chat rooms about Bronski and that article. I would love to hear a couple of your voices talking about what you were speaking about in conversation in those small group rooms. So if you would like to join in and just give us a little rundown of your conversation, you can stick your hand up. Okay, Pam Mannion, go ahead.
Sorry, I had a really interesting group because we had early education and later elementary and then high school. And it was interesting to hear everyone kind of share what their experiences and how it's doable at every age. It just looks different. And really starting with respect and social emotional learning and acceptance, and then building into what our high school teacher said was really infusing into traditional history the components that are new that the law addresses. So I thought that was really interesting.
Thanks. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Other groups, what were you talking about? Go ahead, Emily.
All right. In our group, one of the things that stood out in the article was when they had mentioned about history being more of a movie instead of just a series of snapshots. And then how up until this point, we've had this narrative with a fixed set of facts. Like, this is what we were taught. This is how it is. But now we're getting to the point where we have to start looking at the perspective that it was written from and how it cannot just be the static excuse me, incident where it's evolving, it's changing, and you do have to take into account all different perspectives to get really a better sense of what the situation was and what the history was, not just from one perspective or from one moment in time.
Yeah, thanks for that, Emily. And also that makes us students, folks, because I don't know about you and your educational careers and backgrounds, but I was not exposed to many LGBT history makers or authors during my upbringing and education. And if they were LGBT authors, nobody told us. They just, they were just an author. So we have to do a little bit of work also and homework and try to find out where are these case studies, who are these people, and how do we bring them in and teach about them. So thanks for that, Emily. Other groups, what were you talking about related to the Bronsky article?
I can jump right in there, Dave, if that's
Go
all
for
right.
it, Tracy. Thanks.
Um,
Good to see you, by the way, Tracy.
Same here. It was really nice to see a familiar face on the promo for this. I was really very struck by the names of the powerful people who were listed in this introduction. Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson. So perhaps it's my naivete, my lack of education, and Lily Tomlin. They're advocates. Were they, in part of the community? I don't really know that. What did they do for it?
Yeah, the more modern people who are listed were part of the community. The people who are who go back a ways, we didn't have the kind of language that we have today. So we didn't have, Walt Whitman would not have identified as a gay man because that language did not exist. However, he did have relations with other men. So he would not be called gay necessarily, but he did have relations with other men. So that point is one that Bronsky speaks about, and that's an important thing for us to think about. So how do we do this? Because we've got LGBT people with us throughout the entire history of the world. Understand that they've always been here. They were not. We were not without them ever. They're an important part of what has brought us to the place that we are in right now. However, the naming of them has not always been present or have not always been there. So then the question becomes, how do we find out who are LGBT people that we can look to the past and figure out? How do we figure out that Walt Whitman is what we would call today a gay man? How do we do that with him and with others? And again, those are some of the struggles that we have as we go back into the history. So thanks for that. Thanks for bringing that up. Great talk. Joe Costello, let's hear from you.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to build off what Emily said previously about the idea of history being a movie rather than a snapshot. Because in that same paragraph, Bronsky mentioned, he touched upon the Marxist theory that history is a process, and I was thinking that so much of LGBTQ history is grounded in working class history, probably because of the not having access to privacy, not having access to resources. So like textbooks, and I don't really use the textbook because of how one-sided it is, but even those textbooks that attempt to add diversity to the book and to the subject, there's still this very pro-capitalist bias, and there's still like this condemnation towards the working class. Even when they talk about the gold rush, you don't really hear about same-sex relationships that took place in places like San Francisco. So how do you tell the whole story, the complete story of westward expansion and the gold rush without talking about these relationships taking place? It's just not in the textbook. Even in textbooks that are openly, they want to add diversity, they lack that very basic story.
Yeah. So I mean, Joe, right on. So you have to go to other places. Textbooks are not going to help you with this information. So we have to broaden our spectrums and go other places. I'm going to take just one other voice on this particular issue because we need to move on. Lizette, let's hear from you, and then we're going to move on to another journey. Continue. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to what was just said, that the textbooks, there's no perfect textbook. So even when we find a good text, there are things that are missing. And this source, this book, A Queer History of the United States, is a phenomenal book to help us add on to the history that we are already teaching. So if you haven't used it and you want to incorporate these history lessons into your curriculum, it's a great place to start.
Lizette, thank you for that. And I stick an exclamation point at what you just said. Definitely check out this book. I'm going to give you a couple of other resources before we leave as well, so that will hopefully be helpful. Okay, so let's, again, I'm going to go back to my shared screen. I want to show you a couple of slides again. Just a note, as we think about where to begin teaching this history, as mentioned, LGBTQ people have always been a part of the history of the world, this continent, the nation. I want to start with where American history usually starts, and that is with Columbus and his arrival in the Americas. We need to understand that when he comes here, he brings with him the Christian concept of binary genders. Male and female, very specific attributes assigned to each. And it's important to know and note that that is not the concept that was embraced by Indigenous Americans. They were much more gender flexible and gender fluid. I provided you with a handout about two-spirit people, a word about two-spiritness and the terminology. First of all, two-spirit is not an Indigenous American terminology. So the terminology is in some cases rejected by certain Indigenous groups in the United States. Others, however, do embrace it. It was created in the 1990s to describe gender concepts among Indigenous Americans. And as said earlier, some Indigenous nations have embraced the term, others have rejected it. In the reading, The Two-Spirit People of Indigenous North America from The Guardian, which I gave you all, if you look at the cover to that article, you'll note a picture of Wewa, who's pictured on the cover of the article and who is also mentioned in the Bronsky article. Just a little bit of word about Wewa because it's instructive to us from a number of different perspectives. Wewa was a Zuni from New Mexico, and he was a Lamana. Now, Lamana is the traditional term in Zuni for a gender flexible person, as Wewa was. So in traditional Zuni culture, the Lamana are male-bodied people who take on the social and ceremonial roles usually performed by women in their culture. They wear a mixture of women's and men's clothing, and much of their work is in the areas usually occupied by Zuni women. They are also known to serve as mediators. Some contemporary Lamana participate in the modern Pan-Indian Two-Spirit community. In 1886, Wewa was part of the Zuni delegation to Washington, D.C. They were hosted by anthropologist Matilda Cox Stevenson, and during that visit, Wewa also met up with President Grover Cleveland. So we have a gender flexible person here who at that time, makes his way, makes their way into the White House. So be, aware of these folks. The thing that we need to again think about is while the Christian notion of a binary is present, the Indigenous notion of that binary is non-existent. So having read that article, what I'd like you to do is take a moment. I gave you a graphic organizer in the package. If you want to take that out, you can. If you don't have the graphic organizer, that's fine. But after reading the article, I'd like you to do a little bit of thinking. What in that article connected with you? How did the ideas and information in the reading connect to what you already know? If the article extended things for you, how did this reading extend or broaden your thinking? And then finally, some challenges. Does this reading challenge or complicate your understanding? What new questions does it raise for you? So I'd like you to take a moment, do some writing about connecting, extending, and challenging. Do a little writing about these three areas. I'm going to stop the share and move back to our Zoom room. And I'd love to hear a couple of voices, not too many again, because time is a problem, but a few voices on connections. Any connections that you folks were making as you read this article and things that connected with you? Just connections first. Suzanne.
Well, what we had learned about in class was about how the Native Americans had the, the white supremacist notions of how they should live. They were indoctrinated in these schools that stripped them of their culture and took away all their connections to what for them was a life based in nature. And while I had no idea about sexual norms or gender norms within the Native American communities, it kind of makes sense that if they were so connected to the earth and what is natural, it seems like a beautiful outgrowth of that same notion to be accepted how you were born and not be forced into something, that was so black and white and binary.
Thank you for that, Suzanne. Thanks. Christina, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I connected when they said that that the Native American communities focused this two-spiritness as spiritual gifts, and they really focus on the positive sides of that, and that just really connected me back to what Abby was saying, how she looks at things, everything that's happened to her as positive, and her relationships with her family, even though it may not be as much as a typical family would be in her old community, she's focusing on the positive. And I just thought that was something that resonated with me.
Great. And just a note from what Christine said, the Lamana in the Zuni culture were people who they went to those folks for counsel. They were seen as being more gifted than people who are in a binary situation. So we need to, think about that they actually are given more regard, and they are they're used for counsel and for leadership more so than people who what we would think would be in a binary male-female situation. So thanks for that. I just have a last name, so I'm sorry, but Ian Ciotti, and I hope I pronounced that properly. That's a difficult one. Tell me how badly I did when you speak.
I really have to correct that and update it. My apologies. My name is Tina, and the last name is Lanciotti.
Lanciotti. Okay, I thought it was an I. Okay, thanks. Thanks. So sorry.
That's perfectly fine. I'll have to change that. Connections for me, there's a movie called Two-Spirit. It's about this very same thing. I've been wanting to watch it. It's been on my watch list for a while, about a boy who was murdered on a Native American reservation, who was recognized as being a two-spirit. So I made that connection initially. And I know someone else had mentioned the whole connection with Native Americans and the boarding schools. Also, this whole concept of hair being sort of uniform, men and women wearing the long hair and then being stripped of that in boarding schools. Also, with regards to that gender identity being similar, that idea of wearing hair, braiding hair, and so forth just came to me. And then also with ancient civilizations, so ancient Greek civilizations and so forth, a lot of accounts of homosexuality and different roles in those communities came to me. I just read the book Song of Achilles, in which that's highlighted between Achilles and Patroclus. So those are just some connections that I made. Interesting article.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. Thank you for that. So let's go to a couple of extensions. People, when you were thinking about this and what we were journaling about related to extensions, things that it extended your knowledge in some ways. And again, if you can just raise hands, we'll hear from some of you. Extensions, anyone? Samantha.
Well, it was a new extension after listening to the rabbi bring in those texts from, the 1300s and the 1800s, and now it's kind of extending like it's a very new Western idea to have this male-female binary where there's nothing in between, and we've created this kind of like, it kind of almost reminds me of like our ideas of creating race. Like we've created this polarizations where we didn't need to, but where it never existed, we created it. It didn't exist. I think that's kind of my extension.
Yeah, as colonists, to this continent, it was created by the Europeans who invaded. It did not exist on this continent until the Europeans arrived here. That's a great point to make. Yes. Other extensions, anyone else? I'm going to skip then to challenges. Can we move off to challenges? What kind of challenges does this article bring to you or provide for you? How does it complicate your understandings? Maybe it doesn't.
I'm sorry, I don't know how to raise my hand.
Okay, thanks, Kara, for jumping in.
I was searching, making strange faces, so I apologize. I was thinking that it's time, I think, for me personally, to do some research on where the varying, because there are so many indigenous tribes, and indigenous cultures, where they lie on the spectrum of acceptance of the two-spirit or non-binary reality. And I was thinking that would be an important investigation for me personally, but also for my students, as I do teach on occasion American history. So.
Yeah, great. And that's important because each Native nation has different customs and cultures around this. Some, as I mentioned also, are using the terminology two-spirit and have embraced that terminology. There actually are two-spirit powwows that go on in different places, and others don't. Others reject that terminology and use their native language and other things. So that's a good point, that we are not talking about one unified group here. Thanks. Others? Tracy, go ahead.
Thanks. My challenge, and I don't know if you'll remember, Dave, it was a lot of years ago. I teach the visual arts. I'm not a social studies or history teacher. And after working with Tara, who is my professor, there are many things that I have learned that I now have a challenge to figure out how to fit into my curriculum. So I love this terminology of the two-spirit. To me, it's very romantic and I think palatable for many. But I'm not a history teacher. So how do I find a way to introduce this to high school students without creating a big uproar?
Yeah, just to answer a little bit, and again, get to me in person if you'd like, and I could go deeper here with you, but there are a lot of graphic depictions and so forth of Native Americans and their embrace with each other. There also are many artworks from the Gold Rush era that depict, men in various positions and so forth. So the LGBT piece in art is like huge. And then if you go to the global dynamic of it, you have, even more. So there's a lot of places that you can go. And again, I don't have time to go through all of that for you, but I can't, but I will, again, if you reach out to me, I will definitely assist you and get you some good places to go. So thanks for that. We're going to have to leave here again because again, we are on this always a timeline that we have to be moving. So I'm going to move back to my shared screen, but thanks for that conversation. I'm hoping that some of you can introduce this reading as it is to your students, because this notion of two-spirit, I think, is one that will prompt a lot of conversation from your students about the LGBT community, and also how we navigate placing names and placing notions of maleness and femaleness on others and each other. So let's continue back to my slides. And here are a couple of resources that I want to share with you. It's just a few, but I think you'll find them to be very good. One of them is the Bronsky book, A Queer History of the United States. Learning for Justice, formerly Teaching Tolerance, and I'm so pleased that they changed their name from Teaching Tolerance, because tolerance is kind of the lowest level of getting along with other people. But Learning for Justice is really what they do. They have a wonderful, wonderful podcast series, about 12 episodes, called Queer America, about different pieces of history. And I really recommend you check in with them and check in with that. And again, you can use parts of that podcast with your students. You can take a look at it. Transcripts are also available. So if you want to use text, you can get the text very, very easily. And it's a wonderful, wonderful piece. There's a beautiful documentary called Out of the Past, the struggle for gay and lesbian rights in America, which is available to you. I don't know if any of you touch Facing History in your world, but because I used to work there, I know that this is in the Facing History lending library. So if you want that video, Facing History will send it to you free of charge. It's also available in other places. Lila Rupp and Susan Freeman have a great book, Understanding and Teaching U.S. Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender History. In it, you'll find some great conversation and also some good lesson plans that you can use and take. There's a library reference for those of you who are thinking about, gee, I'd like some stuff in my library at school. The Global Encyclopedia of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer History is available. Of course, kids are not necessarily going to your school libraries right now, as we are remote and hybrid and everything else under the sun. But we look forward to a day maybe when we can go back to a library and grab a book off the shelf. And then finally, there's a book that will help world history teachers, Gay Life and Culture, A World History by Robert Aldrich. Now, if you didn't get all that stuff down, fear not, I can send this through to Adara and she can forward this stuff to you. So some other places we can go. For global studies teachers first, because often you get second shrift as everybody's talking US history all of the time, and I know what that feels like. When you go to ancient Greece and you teach ancient Greece, you have a moment where you can teach about LGBT history, because Plato, in some of his writing, wrote that same-sex lovers were more blessed than ordinary lovers. He later changes that utterance, saying that same-sex relations are utterly unholy. But it's interesting to at least know that he, said this at one moment, and then something happened to change his mind, and he moved in another direction. Also, the Greek god Hermaphroditus, who possesses both male and female biological characteristics, or what we would call today an intersex person, is pictured and is available and is part of Greek mythology. And you can go there and look at that when you look at ancient Greece. For those of you teaching ancient Egypt, the sixth pharaoh of Egypt, Hatshepsut, was a woman. After her 7th year of rule, however, she is always pictured and referenced as a man. And there are many reasons why that may have happened, but it's interesting to take a look at that and go down that road with your students, why this woman pharaoh became a male pharaoh and what that was about. You can also look at cross-dressing in history. In the theatric area, Shakespearean theater, all of the actors for all of the parts are male. So they are cross-dressing. In the Kabuki theater, originally all the actors for all the parts were female, and then later on, it was taken over by males. And to this day, if you see a Kabuki performance, all of the parts are played by males. Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, two of the greats of the Renaissance era, both were known to have male lovers. If you want to show your students the upper right-hand portion of the Sistine Chapel mural, you will see many men who are embraced as painted by Michelangelo. You might want to ask them questions about why they think Michelangelo put that into that mural. Louis XVI, dressed in a most magnificent way, and it's a moment where you can have students examine pictures of his dress through portraiture that was made of Louis. It's a way to discuss how society constructs what is male and what is female, because if you looked at Louis and his garb, much of what he wore then would probably be designated as looking very female or feminine today, but at that time it was seen as being male. So how does that change? What kind of constructs do we have in our societies that define what maleness and what femaleness is? And just a note related to all of global history, as you go through various places around the world, the notion of male and the female binary does not exist in all places. So be aware of that. I mean, we have looked at history through the Euro and through the Christian lens for a very long time. So we seem to pull that binary into a lot of our history teaching and readings and books and so forth, as was mentioned earlier by, I think it was Joe who said this, but be aware that that's not the case when we were looking around the world. Not all societies are structured the way the European society has been. For US history teachers, again, take a look at some clothing of the founding fathers and their wives. Again, that question of what is male, what is female, how is this a societal construction, can be used to challenge the notion of the gender binary. Again, thinking about, is there something beyond male and female? Cross-dressing is important in United States history. We have many accounts of women who dressed as men, passed as men to fight in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and also to vote. And we can bring those to the forefront and think about why they were cross-dressing, what that meant at the time. And also for those who continue to, even after the wars, continue to take on the gender of male after the wars were over and they no longer had to get involved in those uniforms. The gold rush, which Joe also mentioned, is a good place to teach. You have a load of men who are all going out west together. The women are staying home. You have a large group of men who are living together, breaking male norms of the time. There's some great artwork through the gold rush that shows and depicts men doing all kinds of things, from hanging wash to reading to each other to a lot of other intimacies. And plus we know that there are also some love letters that are being written from man to man, from male to male during that time period. And clearly there were some gay men who were involved in the history during that time period. So it's a place that you can go as you teach that history. Another place that you can go is to the Boston marriage. These are women who in the late 1800s were partnering with each other, and there was nothing wrong seen with it. And I also want to mention about the gold rush also, when you see these pictures and depictions and so forth, nobody thought there was anything wrong with this stuff. So that in the US history, this is not always raising eyebrows, and it is not always seen as being strange and different. There are moments and periods of our history where we are embracing same-sex relations, and it is not something that's seen as being evil or bad. And we'll talk in just a moment about how that comes to pass. Partnerships between women that passed, again, with little negative social commentary. If you're teaching about Jane Addams and the Progressive Era, you should also teach that she was involved in a Boston marriage with Mary Rosette Smith, who's important because it was Mary Rosette Smith and her finances that helped to finance much of the work that Jane Addams was actually doing. The Lavender Scare, you're probably teaching about Joe McCarthy and the Red Scare. Well, McCarthy also went after the LGBT community. and was digging in and trying to find homosexuals. And the words that he and his committee were using at that time were perverts. And when they were attaching the word pervert to people who were involved in gay and lesbian relationships. That Lavender Scare is going to kick off what probably is, in the history of the United States, the worst period in history for members of the LGBT community. They are being hunted out. They are being fired at their jobs. They are not being hired for jobs. They are being arrested for crimes. The crime that they were arrested for was defined at that time as sodomy, and it was a dark period. But the Lavender Scare is worth digging into with your students. You teach the civil rights movement, no doubt. You should teach about Bayard Rustin, without whom the March on Washington in 1963 probably never would have happened. Rustin really taught King how to use nonviolence and the notion of civil disobedience. And Rustin was the key organizer, as I said, for the March on Washington. We all know of King's address to the crowd. Rustin also gave a small speech at that gathering as well. So you can take a look at Bayard Rustin in the movement. And then finally, the Stonewall Revolution, which really kicks off what has become the gay rights, the LGBTQ rights movement, and the fight for civil rights for all people, regardless of their gender and who they love. Stonewall Revolution is an important moment that you can teach about. So these are places you can go with your students in terms of some of these histories. So I want to leave you with one final piece. We'll do a quick work on this. I want to introduce you to Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. Those of you who are world history teachers, I'm giving you this. I've given the US history teachers the two-spirit people, the indigenous Americans that they can use in their classrooms. And if you're teaching world history and you're doing particularly a unit on German unification, you might want to take a look at the work of Karl Heinrich Ulrichs. He was a German lawyer, journalist, author who is seen today as a pioneer of the modern gay rights movement, sought equal treatment for individuals who preferred same-sex partners. Again, you will not see him use the word gay back at that time, but he just, referenced the fact that he appreciated same-sex partners in his life. And I gave you a reading from the New York Times about that. I didn't have you read that one ahead of time. So if we can, maybe just do a quick read of that. I'll give you a couple of minutes to take a look at that article, do some reading, and then I've got a quick activity for us to engage in, which will wrap up our time together. I'm just going to leave the share. You can continue your reading. And because of time, folks, I'm gonna have to wrap up our session together. Unfortunately, we got started a little bit late because Abby went over a bit from her time, so I didn't get a full time to have with you. So I'm gonna have to abort the activity that I had attached to this lovely reading. But please do read it. Here's something I want to mention to you. A lot of you were involved in taking the teaching the Holocaust courses. There's a Holocaust connection to this because Ulrichs was persecuted in Germany because of paragraph 175 of the Prussian Penal Code, which was a law against sodomy. It is that same paragraph 175 that is going to be used by the Nazis and by Hitler to lock up the folks who were part of the LGBTQ community during the time of the Holocaust. So that connection exists with Ulrichs as you take a look. Hopefully I've given you a little bit of something to use. I want to mention this. In my movement around, what I've seen from teachers in New Jersey is you have really done a great job around social emotional learning issues around LGBTQ kids. You're taking good care of them. You really understand them. You're open to them, and you're helping them navigate their lives in a most magnificent way. However, when we're asked to teach this history, a lot of us jump in and say, well, wait a minute, I don't know the history. I don't know anything. I don't know any case studies. Where can I find some? Hopefully I have given you a couple of those case studies today. I, again, would like to tell you that I am open to contact, connect with me, talk to me, even in your school district. If you are having issues around that, I've been doing a lot of trainings with teachers about teaching LGBT history, which has helped a lot of social studies departments around the state. So please keep the doors open. Happy to speak with you, happy to communicate with you. And I thank you, and love you all for the great, great work you're doing in these most difficult times where you've had to, become the remote teacher, the hybrid teacher, and maybe back to having students in the class teacher and then going back the other way. Through the pandemic, you folks have been heroic. I really appreciate you and appreciate all that you've done. So thanks to all of you, and thanks for this time today. Thank you, Adara, for having me, and thank you all for the great work you do. And I'll stay on. If any of you have questions, I will stay on for a few moments if you have some time. So to the rest of you, Adara, it's your gig to dismiss people, but I will stay on, and if anybody wants to talk.
Of course, we understand, class is, done. We made it, technically our class went until